A Kangaroo Fern production.
Hey everyone. I want to talk about something important today because it's time to get back to our roots around free expression on Facebook and Instagram. I started building social media to give people a voice. I gave a speech at Georgetown 5 years ago about the importance of protecting free expression, and I still believe this today. But a lot has happened over the last several years. There's been widespread debate about potential harms from online content. Governments and legacy media have pushed to censor more and more. A lot of this is clearly political, but there's also a lot of legitimately bad stuff out there. Drugs, terrorism, child exploitation. These are things that we take very seriously, and I want to make sure that we handle responsibly. So we built a lot of complex systems to moderate content. But the problem with complex systems is they make mistakes. Even if they accidentally censor just 1% of posts, that's millions of people. And we've reached a point where it's just too many mistakes and too much censorship. The recent elections also feel like a cultural tipping point towards once again prioritizing speech. So we're going to get back to our roots and focus on reducing mistakes, simplifying our policies, and restoring free expression on our platforms. More specifically, here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to get rid of fact checkers and replace them with community notes similar to X, starting in the US.
Welcome to today's episode of Santos Unfiltered, where we are diving into a major shift in social media moderation. Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg just announced a significant change to their content moderation strategy, moving away from their established fact checking program in favor of a community driven system similar to X approach. This move coming into the heels of 2024 US presidential election alongside Meta apparent warming of relation with President-elect Trump signals a dramatic shift in how one of the world's largest social media platform will handle misinformation. The change will affect billions of users across Facebook, Instagram, and Threads, marking what Zuckerberg's goal a cultural tipping point toward once again prioritizing speech. On today's episode, we're talking to Dr. Alexia Maddox. She is the Director of Digital Education and Senior Lecturer in Pedagogy and Education Futures in the School of Education. Her main academic role is teaching into digital literacy units in the undergraduate and master program alongside a supporting student research project. Please welcome to the Santos Unfiltered, Dr. Alexia Maddox. Hello, how are you today?
I'm very well. Thank you so much for such a kind welcome.
First question I have, this is one of I just saw your article on your blog about this. It's a good insight and that regarding about this fact checking. My first question to you, doctor, is that what are the key differences between the fact checking program and the community driven modernization system?
The key difference is, of course, the first one is that it's the fact checking program is done by professionals, so to speak. So people who've got I guess, credibility and a professional standard for what a fact is, what sources are credible, and how we actually verify information. So there's a protocol and a process that we would understand to be a credible way to authenticate information and knowledge. And the community driven model, of course, is far more wide ranging in terms of its quality. And we often see something very similar in Reddit, for example, where you'll have a Reddit thread and everyone comes in with an opinion. Some people are very informed and they get upvoted, and some people are really not very informed and they might have sources or ideas that are not well supported in the evidence. And so it's that difference between rigor and the quality of the sources and the ability to discern. So, that kind of critical information literacy. And in a community checking model, that's very broad. And so, it, of course, can involve experts like myself. and it's voluntary. Whereas with a fact checking organization, it's organized, people are paid to do it, and they bring a certain kind of information literacy to the role. So they're vastly different models.
So, what challenges might Meta face in implementing this community driven system effectively?
Well, essentially, what they're doing is outsourcing that kind of information credibility verification process to a community on a voluntary basis. And so, of course, you'll have wide amounts of variation in terms of the quality of the kinds of commentary or critical fact checking that occurs. And it might involve fact checking organizations, actually. So it's not mutually exclusive. This model, a fact checking organization could jump in on a community notes approach. But you'll sort of see there's often a lag around that kind of real time engagement when information comes forward, and so with information that's circulating on social media, some research has suggested that about 80% of the shares occur before a community network fact checking process can jump in. And so we're really looking at a lag between when something is shared and when it's verified. And that community model often that lag is often quite evident in that model. So it's not a perfect system. That's not to say that fact checking is a perfect system when it's done by professional organizations either. So it's more that when we're looking at information credibility, we're looking at a toolkit of approaches rather than one or the other. And in this instance, um, Meta had the opportunity to bring in the community fact checking approach as well as the organizational version, but they actually chose to get rid of that kind of professional critical fact checking and rely purely on a community driven model, much like X that was previously Twitter.
That's interesting. So, what will be the impact or quality of information on this Meta platform, and how could this community-driven system also affect user trust in Meta platform?
It's a very interesting question. So I think you've got kind of two questions here. If you don't mind, I'll pull them apart. And the first one is how will it affect the quality of information that's shared? And the second one is how will users trust the information that they receive? And so in terms of the quality of information that is shared, when it's a community-driven model, people are going to have to be very clear on the source and the authority of that source of that statement. So you'll get very much like influencers and political figures in social media. They might have on Twitter previously, they had the blue tick or the verification. And so they became perceived as more credible. And what we'll be looking at in these early shares is the potential that statements will get amplified that are not credible or evidence-based statements, and that it will be quite a lot slower before any kind of critical verification process might pick it up. But actually, when we're talking about the spread of information and the spread of credible or information that has an evidence base or credibility to it, um, that's not just the only thing that Meta is removing. So they're also removing a lot of the kind of content moderation approaches that mitigated hate speech and sort of when people would pile on vulnerable populations and bring racist comments or sexist comments or gender-based comments or homophobia or all the different kinds of fears and abuses that we bring to each other in these spaces, as well as the joy and awesomeness. And so they're actually removing a lot of those baseline checks. And so it's not just about the potential that if we remove one of the toolkit, which is that kind of credible fact checking, that the misinformation will spread. It's also that they're removing other content moderation approaches, which will probably not mitigate as much the kind of hate speech that we do see amplified. So they're actually doing two things. Often you'll see the commentary sits in one camp or the other, but the approach is a bit multifaceted in that they're reducing the amount of content moderation that they'll be doing, and fact checking was one of those content moderation approaches.
So it's gonna be like I think they're looking at approaching like the Twitter as well on this scenario. What will be what will be the safeguard of this? Because if some people say it's a free speech, but what how do you know it's everything is free speech? Sometimes they're gonna use that for a certain issue.
That's right. So, for example, we know that on Twitter, the kinds of conversations that occur, there's much more of the far right present on Twitter and much more content that is not necessarily related to kind of diverse democratic thinking or information credibility. So we know that Twitter is, with the model and approach that they're taking, it's more politically to the right, and it's more likely that conspiracy theories will be distributed in these spaces. So that kind of uh, type of information branching is occurring quite prolifically on X at this point in time, and that is linked to the kind of free speech attitude that the platform is taking towards content on it. And so, of course, Facebook is different to Twitter, and it does have different kinds of community processes. It's got, groups, it's got public spaces, private spaces. So it will be quite variable as to the effect of this. And of course, one of the things that we are likely to see less of is people being taken down for saying stuff that got picked up by automated content moderating, but actually wasn't a problem. So that's, there are some bennies to this, but really not that much. Not when we're looking at the losses that are happening. When it was the last 4 years or so, we've seen a lot more work around fact checking and information credibility and verification, and a lot more content moderation around hate speech occurring. So those are duty of care processes and infrastructure that these platforms do actually need to be taking. And what we're seeing is a shift away from that, and a shift more towards the laissez-faire, open market, more speech is good speech kind of approach. And that is not necessarily the case. And so, for me, I'm not really here to say that we need a patriarchal, repressive, platform system where everything must be moderated and people can't speak out of school. And, that's definitely not what we want. We do want those relative freedoms, but not at the cost of vulnerable populations, and not at the cost of reducing the quality of information and knowledge that people have access to. So that balance is really important.
Mm. So, how might the government or regulatory bodies like the Safety Commission about what they do you think what they gonna be respond to these changes to Meta?
Well, we've already seen a few responses internationally, and so it's an interesting tension here, because just to step back from that specific question of the Australian context, what we're seeing is essentially this kind of changing attitude of big tech companies that are based out of the US and have their primary headquarters and operation centers there. Is that now they have a government coming in that is much more permissive and less likely to be pressuring them to put on duty of care approaches and infrastructure into their platforms. And so they want that approach globally. And because the US is such a powerful market, and it's a powerful political voice, and it's powerful economically, you see a lot of countries coming in line, because these products almost are invaluable internet infrastructures or web infrastructures or communication infrastructures in some countries. But those countries have different laws. And so this kind of freedom of speech ethos or attitude coming out of the US doesn't necessarily map to other countries, like in the European Union, where there is a really a Digital Safety Act that is quite extensive and has a lot of really positive user protections expected in it. And so what we're seeing is Zuckerberg had made it very clear that he was going to use the US government support to push back against countries like the European Union. And he used a lot of spin in his language to suggest that rather than fact checking, this was really about, surveillance and control and biasing media. So he's already trying to put language into the situation. And so you've seen the European Commission actually come up and push back against that, saying that they're not doing censorship, but they do have laws, and there is a difference between legal content and illegal content under those conditions. And so what we're going to see here is a real power play emerging, and that's really what he's signaling. They clearly, Facebook and Meta and a lot of the large social media companies are really not keen to be so heavily regulated. And you've seen in Australia already, we've had some very serious regulations come in that will, change young children's access to the to social media. And companies are not keen on this because it's shutting down their markets. So these are the kind of complicating factors. And so I think you will see from an Australian perspective that we will still expect these companies to abide by the legal jurisdictions and expectations around what is appropriate in these online spaces. But we are more likely now to see very emboldened social media companies using bullying tactics in order to override those legal expectations. So I think we're in for a fight.
Sure is, especially in Australia, if this is implemented here in Australia. So I was reading on your article yesterday about this. What really, what do you think really is this agenda really about? Why now, when President-elect Trump is coming into the office, why now this Mark Zuckerberg done this fact checking? Yeah, why now?
Why now? So what we definitely are seeing, Zuckerberg himself used the term cultural shift. And when we've seen the language around Trump coming in again in his second term here, it's marking a cultural shift towards environments that are more permissive to some of the behaviors that perhaps we're not keen on. So, for example, behaviors which is stigmatizing transgender people, um, sort of reversing some of the really progressive and perhaps what we would hope is respectful behaviors towards each other in difference. And so Trump has been one of those populist presidents who has really gone back to some very gendered, very basic kinds of expectations of who people are and how we behave to each other. And so, in bringing him on board, people are setting the tone for what this sort of expected environment, social environment, political environment, and economic environment is likely to be in the US. And because the US is so influential culturally in Australia, in some parts of Southeast Asia, in Europe, in most economies that have any kind of dependency to the US market, we're going to see those attitudes flowing through. So it's not only that the tech companies do feel like they're empowered and emboldened to pursue a particular agenda that doesn't necessarily always show care towards the user and financial commitment to implementing the kinds of quality controls and care controls and opportunities that privilege user requirements and needs. They are literally trying to produce a different model that really cuts down on those care practices and really sort of is more perhaps extractive around our personal data and taking more digital rights away from us. So I think that's one shift, and it's in terms of what the platforms are likely to try for. And then we're also going to see this social shift towards perhaps a less caring kind of and accepting kind of culture. So it's almost like a 1-2 that is occurring in the political climate that brought Trump in, which is this kind of more conservative, sort of social backlashy, populist kind of approach with a perceived powerful leader. But on the other side of that, it economically, I think, and economically and technically, what platforms can extract from their users will become more pervasive.
Thank you so much for that. My last question, Dr. Maddox, is that what are the long-term consequences of removing the fact-checking system on the Facebook, Instagram, or Threads for the platform users and society as a whole?
So, what we really need in these spaces, and as we have seen through a lot of the pandemic discussions, that there's sort of increasing foothold that conspiracist thinking has on the way that people understand epidemics, pandemics, public health, and politics, we're seeing that. Very much proliferating in society, and it's really a part of the social polarization of how we understand information and what information we're being exposed to, and then what we feel is right, and whether our views are being healthily challenged, and whether we're sharing the same kinds of information sources in order to have some kind of productive conversation about them. This is possibly going to continue to get worse rather than better. And it's not that, for example, the community content moderation approaches aren't helpful. They definitely are. It's more that there's this clear agenda for platforms to cut back on these kinds of moderation approaches that are really about supporting information credibility and are really about supporting fair and equitable access to information, and are really about supporting the opportunity for people to have diverse views, and for all voices to be heard at the table. So we're seeing a real shift technically away from that, but that's accompanying a shift that we're seeing socially away from that. So we are clearly going through a very conservative time, both in Australia, in the UK, in Europe, and obviously in the US. And these are the times where people with who are socially marginalized or economically marginalized will fare worse and will have less. And so the more the when these sort of mechanisms cut down the amount of credible information they have access to, or take away the mechanisms that they're used to understanding and trusting for verification of good sources, when those things are reduced, and when you also bring in the amount of content produced by artificial intelligence that's in these spaces, it becomes a very user beware kind of environment for people. And we already have low trust in governments. We already have low trust in news media outlets. We already have very low trust in, for example, academic authority and knowledge in universities and things like that. So we're really looking at quite a messy um, future.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Alexia Maddox, the Director of Digital Education, Senior Lecturer on Pedagogy and Education Future in the School of Education at La Trobe University. Thank you.
Thank you.
As for the eye opening discussion with Dr. Alexia Maddox about Meta's dramatic pivot in content moderation. As we explore today, this shift from professional fact checkers to a community driven system represent more than just a technical change. It's a fundamental reshaping of how information is verified on the platform used by billions. While Meta maintain it will continue moderating certain harmful content, this move combined with a recent leadership changes and the company apparent realignment with the incoming Trump administration suggests we're entering a new era of social media governance. The real impact of this decision will unfold in the coming months as the community node system roll out across Facebook, Instagram, and Threads. Until next time, keep questioning, keep thinking critical, and don't forget to subscribe to stay informed about the ever evolving landscape of social media and tech policy. This has been Santos Unfiltered, and this is Miko Santos, and we'll catch you in our next episode. Thank you.